Robert E. Lee, Gallant Christian Soldier, by Lee Roddy Chapter 9. 5 Confederate Generals. 5 Virginia generals were carefully chosen for Lee's 1863 campaign. There was the dependable, serious-minded Stonewall Jackson. There was also Jeb Stuart, another fighting man of strong religious convictions. James Longstreet, senior division commander, was familiarly called Old Pete. He had one major flaw as a fighter. He was slow in action. However, Lee had to take a chance because Longstreet was a fine, all-around soldier. Richard H. Anderson and A.P. Hill rounded out Lee's top 5 most proven generals. These two needed more experience, but Lee thought they were qualified for the campaigns he planned. Lincoln also worked on improving the Union's command. Burnside was replaced by Joseph Hooker. Lee wrote of a problem on March 27th. I have felt so unwell. He had not been able to go anywhere and was suffering from a heavy cold. The doctors ordered him out of the tent and into a private home near Fredericksburg, where he could have a bed. Further examination followed Lee's symptoms of a good deal of pain in my chest, back, and arms. It came on in paroxysms. The doctors called it inflammation of the heart sac. Modern doctors believe Lee had suffered a mild heart attack with permanent damage to his heart. Sandy-haired Joe Hooker was moving by the middle of April, and Lee, who was feeble, worthless, and can do but little, as he wrote Mary, had to move his 6,000 ill-equipped troops against Hooker's 130,000 well-provisioned, blue-clad soldiers. The 2-to-1 disadvantage was tested at Chancellorsville. As usual, Lee seemed to know what his opponent would do. He called in Jackson and explained he thought the Federals would attack with General John Sedgwick backing Hooker. Lee ordered troops at Fredericksburg to watch Sedgwick while he concentrated on Hooker. Jackson, wearing a full dark beard, sat on a cracker box while his commander, similarly seated, finished telling his plans. But Lee was one to let his general speaking before ordering them to action. General Jackson, Lee said, what do you propose to do? Jackson referred to the map. Chancellorsville had only one mansion and some small buildings in a wilderness clearing. But now 50,000 unwelcome Federal visitors were camped there. Jackson pointed a long finger. He traced a route through the woods shown on the map. Go through there, Jackson said. What troops will you need? My whole corps. Jackson's hand stroked his bearded chin. Lee was thoughtful. Jackson's 28,000 men would try to sweep around the vastly superior forces. Lee would be left with about 15,000 men, for Anderson was using troops to build breastworks and the other Virginia generals had more soldiers. Lee decided to let Jackson make the sweep. Stonewall moved off while Lee waited. At shortly after 5 o'clock that afternoon, Jackson's corps followed a bugle corps to action. They caught the blue-clad soldiers cooking dinner, unaware of danger at their backs. These particular soldiers were mostly Germans, paid to fight for the North. They didn't speak much, if any, English. Their surprise turned to terror. They ran. Jackson's boldness had triumphed again. In all the war, no sweep had been more successful, but there was a terrible price. Lee learned about it in the deep 3 o'clock darkness the next morning. Stonewall Jackson has been severely wounded, reported Captain Wilborn, Jackson's signal officer. Lee sat up. What? It was an accident. His own men. It's serious. Lee cried. Ah, Captain, any victory is dearly bought which deprives us of General Jackson, even for a short time. Wilbourn said he had been riding with Jackson in the darkness after the surprised Federal troops were routed. Confederate shots had rung out sharp, striking Jackson in the right hand and left arm. The wound had come from his own men. The surgeons are trying to save the arm, Wilbourn added. Lee got up from the ground where he had been laying under a waterproof cloth. He sent Jackson a note. Could I have directed events, I would have chosen for the good of the country to be disabled in your stead. I congratulate you upon the victory which is due to your skill and energy. The battle continued into the morning. Lee was observed, unruffled on Traveler's back, as shells burst around him and shot plowed up the ground. The wounded were trying to crawl from the places where flames still flared in the brush. The soldiers' faces were blackened with battle. Lee guided the big gray horse toward the Chancellorsville mansion, which was burning as Hooker retreated and the tide of battle passed. The weary Virginians, seeing Lee, gave a mighty rebel yell. It was their way of honoring the gray-bearded man who had again given the Army of Northern Virginia a victory against superior odds. The yell of praise was mixed with screams of the dying and wounded. There were 13,000 Southern casualties at Chancellorsville, but the Union had lost 17,000 men. A report came that Jackson's arm had to be amputated. Lee knew that infection was now the big danger. He sent another message. He has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right arm. Chancellorsville had been a Southern victory, but at a terrible price. While waiting for further details on Jackson, Lee surveyed the military situation. Through a mix-up in orders, Sedgwick had been allowed to move from Fredericksburg. It posed the possibility that he would link up with Hooker, who had fled across the Rappahannock River. On May 6th, word came that Jackson had developed pneumonia. Lee, recalling that he and Jackson had attended religious services together on April 26th, sent another note of encouragement to the sinking Jackson. Give him my affectionate regards and tell him to make haste and get well. Lee knelt and prayed in the destruction which had been Chancellorsville. He prayed with the agony of spirit while his troops slept and Jackson fought for life. Lee went to church services on Sunday. A chaplain told Lee that Stonewall was slipping fast towards death. Lee shook his head, remembering that Jackson had expressed a wish to die on the Sabbath. Lee cried, "Surely General Jackson must recover. God will not take him from us, now that we need him so much. Surely he will be spared to us, in answer to the many prayers which are offered for him." When the services were over, Lee approached the chaplain with another message for Jackson. "When you return, I trust you will find him better. Give him my love and tell him that I wrestled in prayer for him last night as I never prayed, I believe, for myself." Lee turned sharply away as the chaplain guessed, so the clergyman would not see the deep emotion the general felt. He was in his headquarters tent some time later when he heard a whispered conversation outside. Lee raised his head expectantly. The dark eyes, now alert with questioning hope, saw a paper in the soldier's hand. Lee took it quietly. The awful truth crept over him like a chill. Jackson's mind had wandered far in a coma which pneumonia brought. He had talked much, saying military things. Then Jackson said quite clearly, but in a low voice, "Let us pass over the river and rest under the shade of trees." With those words, he died. Lee had indeed lost his right arm. He lost one of his only aggressive fighting generals who would follow orders. The loss of the great and good Jackson caused Lee to weep, but there was little time to mourn. If Lee was still to force the North to come to terms, he had to keep moving. An invasion of Pennsylvania was designed to bring more pressure on northern home front and make the people there seek peace. Soon fresh field crops would be ripe in Pennsylvania, where the war had not touched. Peas and beans would be available for Lee's hungry men. Once his objectives there were met, he could move on toward northern cities. Lee's second invasion of the North pulled pursuit by Hooker's replacement, George Meade. Lincoln was still trying to find one general who could compete with the Virginian who always seemed to know the Union officers' plans. It was also Lee's hope that Ulysses S. Grant would be concerned about the Pennsylvania invasion and relieve this battering assault on Vicksburg, a city which controlled traffic on the Mississippi River. Gettysburg was a small Pennsylvania village in the path of Lee's army. In early July, the Gray troopers marched towards it. Union dismounted cavalrymen with new 8-shot Spencer repeating carbines happened to be in the crossroads town. The Blues and Grays clashed in an unplanned battle, and the rebels' manpower drove the Federals back in spite of their superior firepower. Survivors of this unexpected first firing dug along Cemetery Hill south of town, giving the North an advantage. Lee ordered Richard Ewell to attack this position, but Ewell, delayed by reinforcements, came up. This cost Lee his first major chance for victory. The northern trenches grew deeper in the delay. Longstreet of the First Corps was always a slow, cautious fighter. He tried to talk Lee into waiting for the Federals to attack while the Confederates dug into a strong position. Lee was fighting blind, lacking reports from cavalry scouts under Stuart. Lee said, "In the absence of reports from him, I am in ignorance as to what we have in front of us here. It may be the whole Federal army, it may be only a detachment." The situation grew worse when Longstreet delayed into going into action as ordered by Lee. On July 2nd, Ewell was late in attacking because he was waiting for the sound of Longstreet's gun before moving. The battle raged into the third day without a Confederate victory. "Lee is not feeling well," a soldier said. "He walks as if he is weak and in pain," a cavalryman remarked. But the fight had not gone out of the general. He met with Longstreet in the early morning, pointed at a map, and said, "The enemy is there, and I am going to strike him there." Close to 12,000 brave young men from many Confederate states made up Pickett's charge. They swept forward along Cemetery Ridge, where 6,000 Federals popped up from behind fences, trees, and stone walls. Thousands of Confederates dropped from a hail of lead. Some reached the stone walls and vaulted them.